Welcome to today's webinar. We're here today to mark the launch of the building blocks guidance that we released yesterday. And the guidance looks at how to use your CDP disclosures and the CDSB framework to satisfy the TCFD recommendations. So essentially answering some of the most commonly asked questions: where do I get my data from and how do I report it? I have included a link to the guidance in the chat function, and we will also follow up with a copy to all attendees after the webinar. I'm thrilled to welcome such an esteemed panel of speakers today: Marty McBride, who is the Managing Director here at CDSB, Paul Simpson, the CEO of CDP, Tatiana Boldreva, who is the Technical Manager at CDP, and also David Astley, who is Senior Project Officer here at CDSB. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with our work here at CDSB, we are a consortium of environmental and business NGOs, and our work is to provide decision useful environmental information to markets via the mainstream report. So before we dive into the discussions, let me just take you through a small few housekeeping rules. We'll be taking Q&A and questions and answers at the end of this session. So if you would like to submit a question, please do so using the chat function or the Q&A function. Both of these can be accessed on the bottom of your screen by either clicking the little speech icon or the three dots icon beside the speech bubble. Please don't wait until the end. We really want this to be as interactive as possible, so do submit your questions throughout. We'll also have a survey at the end of the webinar, and we're always keen to hear your feedback, so please do also submit your comments and your reviews of today's webinar. We will record this as well and distribute a copy of the recording and the slides afterwards. So without much further ado, I'm thrilled to pass you over to Marty, where she will be in conversation with Paul. Over to you, Marty.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for the fabulous introduction. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for coming along. I really, really love launching action-focused reports and having action-focused conversations. So it's a real pleasure to be welcoming Paul Simpson for the conversation this afternoon to talk about this excellent Building Blocks report. So we're here to celebrate the launch of the Building Blocks report, which is guidance developed by CDP and CDSB on how to successfully fulfill the task force on climate-related financial disclosure recommendations using the CDSB framework and the CDP platform and disclosure, all the fabulous disclosure services that CDP have. So, Paul, perhaps you could kick off the discussion with some insight into what the current situation looks like and state of play with disclosure.
Yes, thank you, Marty. Hi, everybody. Obviously, we're getting used to these virtual events these days. So if we look at the big picture, it's very clear, and you will all be aware, obviously, while the world suffers a critical pandemic, we still face a climate emergency. Everybody be familiar with the Paris Agreement and the science of climate change that ultimately requires an urgent transition in the global economy, that we need to reduce emissions radically. You could say 7.6% annual reduction is required according to the UN. In simple terms, we need to cut emissions in half in the next decade. Emissions have been rising each year, kind of potentially leveling off a bit last year, 2019. The pandemic is slowing emissions, but it's not seen as that will be necessary for the future. It may only be temporary, and it's not a good thing, emissions reducing because of the pandemic. We need to structurally reconfigure the economy. So what's the role of disclosure in addressing climate change? Well, disclosure is really the foundation of a truly sustainable economy. The measurement, the disclosure, the data and the information and the insights that come is critical for creating, driving and understanding the risks and opportunities in a transition that's required. And those risks and opportunities both felt to whole sectors, whole national economies, but also to individual companies. And that's why disclosure really sheds the light on how the transition needs to happen, where the risks and opportunities were likely to be felt, and ultimately, in some senses, who the winners and losers might be if they don't change accordingly. So where are we with climate disclosure today? Well, the great news is we've seen really a lot of progress in the last 20 or so years, and particularly enormous progress since around 2015 with the Paris Agreement, the launch of the TCFD and the TCFD recommendations in 2017. So through CDP, we fully aligned our disclosure platform with the TCFD recommendations in 2018. And last year, 8,400 companies all around the world disclosed through CDP on climate change and other environmental factors such as water and forest, deforestation and supply chains. So that's a 20% increase in 2018. So we see disclosure increasing. Those 8,400 companies, 2,600 of those are large listed companies representing more than half the world's market capitalization. So great progress on climate disclosure. It's not fully there, and we'll get more into that. And I would use a metaphor to say the glass is more than half full, but now we really need to fill it.
Great, thank you, Paul. It sort of set the scene. Now let's think a bit more about, let's focus on TCFD and task force on climate-related financial disclosures. You've just said CDP has aligned the platform to that. The majority of the audience on today's webinar are based in the US regions and in Europe. So what do you think the key developments are across the US and Europe, and where are we seeing the greatest regulatory uptake?
Yeah, thanks, Marty. Well, I mean, the TCFD in itself was really a great development. The fact that the Financial Stability Board had called for a task force on climate-related financial disclosure led by Mark Carney, the then governor of the Bank of England, the chair of the FSB, and also Mike Bloomberg, and was private sector led. It showed a maturity in the markets and a linking of financial stability and climate risk at a level and a scale that we hadn't seen before. So that in itself was a really important development. Since then, with the Paris Agreement, the TCFD, we now see many national, regional governments and regulators progressing. How do we take the TCFD recommendations forward? How do we require them in law, in accounting standards, in other regulations? So a few specific examples. Here in the UK, the Green Finance Strategy sets out the government's expectations that by 2022, large listed companies will be disclosing in line with the TCFD. So that's an expectation, not a complete requirement, but the Financial Conduct Authority has proposed that the UK actually makes it a requirement to disclose in line with the TCFD recommendations, at least on a comply or explain approach. So we can see this move in the UK towards it becoming expected and required. Recently, well, for the last few years, and then with new emphasis in the last few months, the EU and the Non-Financial Reporting Directive already mandates non-financial disclosure. It is required. There are guidelines for that which are voluntary, and those guidelines already incorporate the TCFD recommendations. The Non-Financial Reporting Directive is under review, and we certainly think at CDP, and I know others, including you at CDSB, think that it's likely now is the time for the EU to make that guidance on the TCFD not just voluntary but required, and we expect that to happen. In other places, Mark Carney, who's now stepped down from the Bank of England, but is leading the Green Finance Strategy for the COP26, the UN climate negotiations to be held in the UK at some point next year. Mark Carney has called for a coalition of regulators to come together and announce at COP26 that they will make the TCFD mandatory, and to do so fairly quickly in fairly short order. So I think in Europe, the direction of travel is very, very clear. And just to say that 88% of the Euro 300, the 300 largest listed companies in Europe, already disclosing in line with the TCFD through CDP last year. So the market is ready for this, and the regulators in Europe are really implementing that now. Thanks, Marty.
So slightly provocatively, I could say that, I guess there's 2 points here. I guess one, next week, for those of you that like a webinar, CDSB are launching a review of the top 50 companies in Europe's performance against the Non-Financial Reporting Directive over the last year. And I must say uptake is quite patchy. So that sort of evidence that the Commission isn't getting what it needs from its current reporting requirements, I suspect will lay down some of that, provide some good risk assessment and regulatory assessment to support the expansion of the non-financial reporting directive. So do join us next week if hearing about company reporting against the non-financial reporting directive is of interest to you. Also, I had an interesting conversation with a Bayes minister a few weeks ago about the mandatory reporting of TCFD in the UK, and they expect it to potentially go for consultation in November. So, and incorporate into the Companies Act. So for those of you in the UK, watch this space. I expect it's coming fast. So turning now to look at North America, Paul. Most notably, on Monday, we saw the Canadian government's announcement, which was just fantastic, requiring companies who are receiving COVID-19 finance aid under the Large Employer Emergency Financing Faculty to commit to publishing annual climate-related disclosure reports consistent with the TCFD recommendations. What was your reaction to this, Paul?
Well, I think this is extremely interesting and quite fantastic. We've seen a lot of calls for financial packages for renewal and recovery of the economy to include climate and environmental requirements. And government's in a very challenging time at the moment, but we see the EU say the Green New Deal will be part of the recovery and renewal, and for Canada to come forward and say, for those companies we are providing financial assistance to as part of recovery and renewal, we will require TCFD disclosures is, I think, leading, needs to be copied by others. Sets a really good example that public money is being used to help companies through this current pandemic crisis, as it should be. But also with that are coming requirements about TCFD disclosure. So this is a great step by Canada. I think many other regulators could follow it. And I'll just say a couple of things about the United States. It relates a bit to your point about patchy take-up of non-financial reporting directive in Europe. We actually saw the SEC in 2011 come out with climate change guidance. Companies should incorporate financial risk into their reporting. Very little take-up because it was guidance. Not much has happened in the SEC since because of very obvious wins in the United States. But it does show that guidance from regulators is helpful, but rules are really what makes things happen and levels the field in the market. In the United States, 72% of the S&P 500 disclosed through CDP last year. S&P 500, the 500 largest companies in the United States. So those 72% already disclosing in line with the TCFD. So I would very much welcome this move from Canada, encourage other regulators to take it and say that I think it's not too long whilst things are slower in the US itself at the federal regulatory level, not necessarily at the state level, that we will see more action in time from the United States. And given the time frame of this, it's largely US and Europe, but it is notable that Japan has also been pushing and promoting TCFD recommendations for companies. China is looking at a mandatory ESG disclosure directive. So other progress also in other parts of the world.
Honestly, it is fantastic. And I think you made a very strong point there that a large percentage of large North American companies already do disclose to CDP. So they have that foundation to get started and actually comply in their mainstream reports. So this announcement further cements the connection between COVID-19 and nature, including how the fallout and recovery should be interlinked. Now is the time for other governments to follow Canada's lead. So let's drill down into the TCFD's recommendation in a little bit more detail. I think it's probably fair to say that while the support for the TCFD has been positive, with over 1,000 organizations worldwide lending their support and their name to the direction of travel, it's clear that urgent action and uptake of TCFD recommendations is required at scale. And taking action could certainly yield advantageous results for companies. One of the benefits of TCFD disclosure is that it helps strengthen governance and risk management on climate and other ESG-related issues. It also gives a bit of that internal muscle to help move these issues forward. But what are the benefits of disclosing and implementing TCFD recommendations in your opinion?
Yeah, Thanks, Marty. And it's notable that next month in June will be 3 years since the TCFD recommendations were launched. So, yeah, mindful. It takes a while for companies to adjust and change things. We hear very often that CDP don't change too much, and if you change it, give us 2 years to kind of get our act together. And I think that's fair, but we're about to be 3 years in, so I wanted to note that. I mean, clearly from our perspective, you know, and I know it's shared by CDSB, there are many benefits of disclosure. You know, one, we were talking about a moment ago, the forthcoming regulatory developments. Well, by disclosing, companies can prepare for and get ahead of regulation, right? Don't wait until it's required and then have to really scrabble to catch up. You know, so companies can remain a step ahead of regulation. I think most importantly, though, disclosure is more than just disclosing. It's a whole process. Measuring, having a strategy, making sure you're thinking about the risks and opportunities and a transition plan. And that enables companies to really uncover risks and opportunities and be really cognizant. What are the risks and the opportunities to our company, to our sector, to the areas where we operate of this transition towards net zero emissions, of other physical climate risks? That's really important. Every company should be really aware of that and have measured and assessed it. And there are, you know, economic benefits of this to companies. Companies can boost their competitive advantage through disclosure. The Stocks Climate Change Leaders Index, which is built using CDP data, and the CDP Climate A-list, the 180 or so companies out of those 8,400 have the best disclosures, outperform the reference index, the market, by 5.3% per annum. So there is a lot of evidence that shows companies who disclose perform well financially. I don't think we can say that's always correlation, but there is here at least causation that companies are well managed, are measuring, preparing well, and disclosing, and that is showing up as better financial performance. Finally, one very interesting study from Oxford and Maastricht University found that companies who disclose environmental data have a lower cost of capital. Their loan interest payments are generally lower. And again, you know, exactly why that is, we could debate for a long while, but you know, disclosure really helps with that. Finally, companies who are disclosing, you know, they can track and benchmark their own progress against their competitors, their peers, their sector. So there's a really good learning from disclosure. You don't just provide information yourself, you get information from others. And you know, for many companies, it's very, very important to protect and improve their reputation. It's worth noting that more than 500 investors with $100 trillion of assets are asking companies to disclose through CDP. The TCFD has many investors, more than 200 financial services firms supporting it and also expecting such disclosure. So disclosing to investors, regulators, and other stakeholders is very important for a company's reputation. I think they're really the key benefits, but no doubt, Marty, you'll be aware of others.
I certainly am, and then some of that was that muscle I talked about earlier, that moving, you know, actually starting to you know, join up bits within a company as well. So we've touched on the CDP platform being aligned to the TCFD a few times already today, and I'm just wondering, we've just had the last round of disclosure, the disclosure cycle at CDP. What sort of trends have you seen emerge around the TCFD from that?
Yeah, thanks, Marty. So, I mean, there are a number of trends. You know, I said before, the number of companies disclosing are increasing up 20% from 2018 to 2019. We know companies are in a challenging environment right now. Everybody is, but we do see already good engagement in the disclosure process this year. It's early to say, you know, how we'll do. So that's very positive. We also see improving quality of data, increasing link of climate impacts to financial impacts. I say increasing, that's from some companies. I think that's really an area also for much needed financial improvement by many. Financial services companies are becoming more engaged. Very interestingly, we see that 70% of large listed companies disclosing through CDP already are able to disclose more than 80% of the TCFD recommendations. So that's really strong. Large listed companies getting to grip with the TCFD. And just to kind of look into that a bit further, some 35% of companies disclosing through CDP last year were able to do all of the CDP recommendations. So really strong improvement, but more to go on this glass half full, need to fill it. Just a couple of areas. One of the TCFD innovations, I often call it, was about scenario analysis. But not a lot of scenario analysis before the TCFD. Shell and a few other companies well known for it, but certainly not common practice. The TCFD recommends scenario analysis for large companies who are heavily impacted by climate change. And last year, 42% of companies disclosing through CDP were able to disclose some information on scenario analysis. So progress in these 3 years, but we need to see a lot more.
Indeed, Paul, I can agree with that. And at CDSB, we power the TCFD Knowledge Hub on behalf of the TCFD Secretariat. So we see a lot of TCFD reports on thinking and learning coming through our inboxes. And I must say, some of the things we see is it's still very much a tick box approach, kind of just do it, just put it in, standalone, rather than being truly integrated across a company's mainstream report, and in places climate and issues are material in one part of the report but not reflected necessarily in the numbers in the back. So we still have a way to go to make this truly interconnected and almost business as usual in how it's reported and considered. But I do agree, 3 years in, there is some significant progress, but we do need to ramp up the pace and the scale of adoption going forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think one area that I know you at CDSB are all over, if we put it that way, is the integration into mainstream reports. You're better placed to comment on that than me. But we see through CDP, the market disclosure platform, we see good improvements. Still got to close that gap. I do think one of the challenges and areas for real improvement is to see more strategic climate information disclosed in mainstream reports.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you there, and also more forward-looking information, definitely as well. But bringing us back to this very important guidance that you and I are here to launch today, and we're always saying that reporting on climate risks and opportunities in line with the TCFD and the mainstream report, it shouldn't be seen as novel or daunting. In fact, when I can't tell you how many TCFD workshops I've delivered over the last few years on a capacity building level, and the question I get asked all the time is, where do I get the data from? And of course, I'm like, well, CDP, use CDP disclosure is the best place to start. So it's good news for all of you on the phone that and the webinar today that are getting started. And if you're not familiar, you most likely have a lot of this data already available, because over 8,000 companies, as Paul said, already do report to CDP. It's the majority of the world's largest companies disclosed to CDP through the climate questionnaire in 2019. And while the information provided in a CDP response covers much of the same ground as TCFD, as Paul stressed, it's essential for these material climate-related disclosures to be then included in the mainstream report to meet the expectations of the TCFD. And that's the integration piece I was sort of referring to earlier. And the CDSB framework is there to help you do this. So this guidance that we're talking about today is based on the building blocks for TCFD success. Paul, what would your advice be to report preparers looking to implement the TCFD recommendations?
Well, obviously, I would say read the building blocks. It's a great report with some high-level information. There's some really good technical analysis, linking CDP data, the CDSB framework to the TCFD. So it really does set out a pathway. What we say, fundamentally, everybody has to start. I saw many on this webinar are already doing TCFD disclosures, some considering it. So, if considering it, you have to start. And you have to start measuring and collecting data internally. Companies collect and measure all sorts of data. Most companies now collect climate and environmental data, and then use the CDP disclosure platform, the structure of the questionnaires to collect and structure your climate data in a TCFD lens. And that's what CDP platform enables you to do. As the building block says, you can then use the CDSB framework to think what and how of that information should go into the mainstream report. And that's really where the CDP disclosure platform, the CDSB framework, and the TCFD recommendations all come together in this very seamless pathway to excellent climate disclosure, and it's very well described in the building blocks. And just a couple other things I'll say that, for companies disclosing, being specific and concrete is very important. Sometimes you read disclosures and they kind of there's a lot of narrative. Some narrative is very important, but you're not quite sure exactly what it means. So being specific and concrete is very important. Being consistent as far as possible. If you're just starting, that can be harder, but to show consistency in your disclosures, and ultimately, as I said, to just start, but really to ensure that you progress rather than let perfect be the enemy of the good. What we know from the investors, what investors want to see is improved disclosures, those integrated into mainstream reports, and also progress each year. So it is that year-on-year progress. People are not going to be badly judged if they're really seeking to understand this and move forward.
Thanks, Paul. Great top tips. I would, if I had to add to what you said, I'd say, and this very much relates back to the sort of conversation we're having today, is before you start, have a look at what you've already got. So what tools you've got, what internal controls are already in place in your organization, what data do you already have? You have to find out what you've got before you get started, and then lay out a timeline and roadmap, and then put pen to paper. I mentioned earlier the TCFD Knowledge Hub. It is full of top tips for how to get started. There's some practical case studies on there from companies as well around specific elements of the TCFD recommendations. So please do have a look at that. We also have a number of how to and what does it look like kind of, the other sort of questions you get asked in workshops, or how do I do it, or what does it look like? Who's doing this well? Who's done good reporting? So we also have some examples of that in the TCFD handbook, and there's also a TCFD implementation guide downloadable from the CDSB website. With all that in mind, let's just quickly look ahead before we hand it over to the experts, Paul. What do you think the road to COP26 looks like for you at CDP?
Yeah, I think, this was set out to be the super year of climate action, 2020. Obviously, COVID has understandably caused some delay here. COP26 was due to be in November in Glasgow, and now moved some point in 2021. My sources tell me most likely to be October, November, but some uncertainty still until the pandemic calms down and is better under control. But I think there are some key things that were required for November, and I can say in some ways people have a little bit more time. Clearly, all large, respectable, well-managed companies need to be publicly disclosing in alignment with the TCFD by the time we now get to COP26. So I talked earlier, the UK government expectation by 2022. If COP26 is late in 2021, I think would challenge every company to really strive to be there, and so be including that information in their mainstream report. That's really what we're talking about today. But a couple of other things. All companies need to be setting targets. One of the TCFD recommendations is the disclosure of targets. We see that nearly 80% of the companies disclose some target, but less than half of companies have an absolute target. Only 11% have a science-based target. So I would say, from a CDP perspective, every company should be having a long-term net zero target and a 5-year science-based target. That's really fundamental to show and drive a transition. And we do expect, Mark Carney will have pulled together a substantial coalition of regulators and governments at COP26, and some of this will happen before, but to announce that the TCFD is becoming mandatory. So again, be well prepared before that announcement comes, and don't get caught out.
Excellent advice, Paul. We'll have some questions at the end for Paul and myself, so do pop them in the chat so Leslie can feed them through to us. But thank you very much, Paul. That was really, really interesting. I learned something, which I love doing, and I'm sure everyone else learned a thing or two that will help with their reporting. But now I'm going to hand it over to Tatiana and David to go through the technicalities of the building blocks paper. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Marty and Paul. Such fascinating discussion. We've already had lots of questions come through, so I'm just going to quickly pull out a few so you can start thinking about them while Tatiana and David are presenting. So far we've had questions around the different trends between finance and non-financial sectors. Are we seeing any similarities or big differences there? Examples of good practices from US companies who have implemented the TCFD very well. So again, to the attendees, if there are specific sectors that you're looking for, do pop those into the chat. If not, we can give you kind of a broad overview of examples of good practice. Also, issues around climate risks are viewed as long-term, and they may not necessarily hold a place in existing enterprise risk management models. So how do we get that on the agenda? Can we incorporate it into existing practices? Should we be revisiting our climate targets and our climate reporting practices over time? So lots coming through there. Do keep continuing to put them in the chat. And now I will pass you over to Tatiana and David, who will talk you through the building block disclosure, or the building block guidance in more detail. Over to you.
Thank you, Leslie, and hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana Boldereva. I'm a technical manager at CDP, and I'm responsible for the development of the climate change questionnaire. Delighted to join you today and to show you a few examples of how the CDP questionnaire can help you to report in line with TCFD recommendations.
Hi, I'm David Astley. I'm a Senior Technical Officer at CDSB and work on a variety of projects relating to corporate reporting and material environmental issues, with a particular focus on climate change. So to reiterate what Marty said, the building blocks guidance has been developed in response to market demands around TCFD. During workshops and webinars we run, we often get asked the same two questions. One, where do we get material climate data and information? And two, how do we report it in the mainstream? We'll move to the next slide. The good news is many companies already have the data and information for effective TCFD disclosures from the CDP submissions. And we believe that the CDSB framework provides the most efficient means of translating that into material mainstream reporting and therefore fully satisfying the TCFD. Tatiana, do you want to walk us through the CDP block in a bit more detail?
Sure, thank you, David. Well, as Paul already highlighted, reporting in line with the TCFD recommendations in the mainstream report should not be seen as something novel or daunting. And over 8,000 companies, including the majority of the world's largest ones, are already disclosing to CDP for its climate change questionnaire. And the questionnaire has been aligned with the TCFD recommendations since 2018. So the information provided in a CDP disclosure covers much of the same ground as what TCFD recommends to be disclosed in the mainstream report. So David, would you like now to elaborate how CDSB framework helps with effective TCFD disclosure?
Sure. The TCFD stresses the importance of reporting material climate-related information in the mainstream report. But the annual report has a number of essential characteristics and expectations that companies need to satisfy when using the well-structured information from CDP disclosures to meet the recommendations. The CDSB framework provides companies with the principles and reporting requirements to be able to repurpose and add to the CDP submissions to meet the expectations of the mainstream report and the TCFD. So if we can move to the next slide. And it is for this reason that CDP and CDSB have created this guidance, the building blocks for companies. The guidance highlights the most relevant CDP climate change questions and explains how this information can be best used for reporting in the mainstream report using CDSB's reporting principles and requirements. The building blocks guidance clearly sets out for companies the how and what of making effective TCFD-aligned disclosures. Now, Tatiana, will you give us a quick overview of the TCFD recommendations?
Yes, so as a quick recap, we can see here a reminder of the TCFD recommendations. They are structured around 4 thematic areas that represent core elements of how organizations operate: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The 4 recommendations are supported by specific disclosures that organizations should include in their reports to provide decision-useful information to investors and other stakeholders. So the table in red at the bottom shows the key questions in the CDP climate change questionnaire that request the disclosure of this information. So the building blocks guidance provides details on each recommended disclosure and how it can be best approached using the relevant CDP questions and CDSB's reporting principles and requirements. For the purpose of today's presentation, and in the interest of time, we will talk you through one example of recommended disclosure from each of the 4 TCFD recommendations to give you an idea of how this guidance can help you to integrate your climate-related information into the mainstream report. So I will take you through these examples of TCFD recommended disclosures and the CDP questions aligned with them, and David will explain the related CDSB's reporting principles and requirements. So if we move on to the next slide, please. We'll start with the first recommendation on governance. We will use an example of the recommended disclosure A, describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. According to TCFD, disclosing this information is important because it supports evaluations by investors and other stakeholders of whether climate-related issues receive appropriate attention by the board. The key question in the CDP questionnaire that requests this information is C1.1b, provide further details on the board's oversight of climate-related issues. This question requests details on the governance mechanisms that exist in the organization and how these mechanisms contribute to the board's overall oversight of climate-related issues. Over to you, David.
So requirement 1 of the CDSB framework offers a number of additional disclosure requirements that may assist companies in demonstrating governance and accountability for climate-related issues. So this could be explaining the internal or external resources drawn on, the number of meetings that discuss climate-related risks and opportunities, or the frequency of the updates on strategy and targets. In addition, when repurposing the CDP disclosures, the Building Blocks Guide offers that companies must ensure that it is properly connected and integrated with existing governance disclosures, following Principle 3 of the framework. In doing so, companies should be wise of Principle 5 of the CDSB framework, making sure the need for a balance of detail and clarity is met. For instance, diagrammatic approaches to identifying responsibilities and pathways accountability for climate issues may be beneficial. Now let's move on to a strategy example.
So the strategy recommended disclosure A asks to describe the climate-related risks and opportunities that the organization has identified over the short, medium, and long term. This information, and in particular the potential impacts of the identified risks and opportunities on the organization's strategy, is used to inform investor expectations about the future performance of the organization. There is a number of questions in the CDP questionnaire that allow you to disclose all this information, and they are listed here on the left-hand side. Among the key strategy disclosures, according to TCFD, is a description of what companies consider to be relevant short, medium, and long-term time horizons, taking into account the specifics of their business and the useful lifetime of their assets. This information is reported for question C2.1a in the CDP climate change questionnaire. TCFD also recommends to include a description of the specific climate-related issues for each time horizon that could have a material financial impact on the organization. CDP requests this information in questions C2.3a and C2.4a. These questions allow companies to provide details on the risks and opportunities identified over various time horizons, their potential financial impacts, and what actions they take to respond to risks and to capitalize on opportunities. David, would you like to take us through the related CDSB principles and requirements?
Sure. Requirement 3 of the CDSB framework similarly asks companies to disclose the material risks and opportunities identified over different time horizons. In addition, it asks companies to set out what is expected in terms of the nature of the risk and its business implications. When using CDP disclosures, though, the Building Blocks paper advises that companies must ensure that the disclosed risks and opportunities meet the materiality definitions used in the mainstream report. Principle 1 of the CDSB framework offers a two-step process to companies in such decisions, offering report preparers a suite of tests to distill down the most material information. In addition, when preparing information for disclosures for the mainstream report, it should be remembered that climate-related risks and opportunities can be highly uncertain and dependent on many different factors outside the control of companies. For this reason, when using their CDP responses, the guidance draws attention to CDSB's second principle, faithful representation, and suggests that it is applied and that key uncertainties and assumptions are explained in the mainstream report so that investors can act appropriately. I'll now pass back to Tatiana to start discussion of our third example.
Another important area of the TCFD recommendations is risk management. According to TCFD, investors and other stakeholders need to understand how an organization's climate-related risks are identified, assessed, and managed, and whether those processes are integrated into existing risk management processes. This information is important for users of climate-related financial disclosures because it helps to evaluate their organization's overall risk profile and risk management activities. So risk management recommended disclosure A states that organizations should describe their processes for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. The key questions in the CDP questionnaire that request this information are C2.1, C2.2, and C2.2a. C2.2 asks companies to report their processes for identification and assessment of climate risks, and C2.2a gathers information on what risk types are considered. And the risk types in this question and throughout the CDP questionnaire are aligned with the TCFD recommendations and cover both risk related to the transition to a low carbon economy, or so-called transition risks, and risks related to the physical impact of climate change, or physical risks. Over to you, David.
So again, turning to requirement for the CDSB framework, that requirement asks companies to make clear how climate-related issues have been integrated into risk management processes and systems, taking the position that they shouldn't be treated separately from other corporate risks and opportunities. The third principle of the CDSB framework on connectivity with other mainstream disclosures is of real importance here then. This is, one, about making the connections between the risks and opportunities identified and the processes used to do so, and two, how climate and its characteristics have been integrated into the risk identification and management processes. In doing so, Principle 4 of the CDSB framework, which concerns consistency and comparability, can offer a helpful guide for companies reporting on their climate risk processes. In reporting in the mainstream report, how the differences inherent to these climate risks, so for example, timelines and scopes of impact, have been integrated should be rationalized for report users. And now if we can move to our final example.
Yes, so finally, the fourth area covered by the TCFD recommendations is metrics and targets. TCFD highlights the importance of access to the metrics and targets used by companies to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. And this is important for several reasons. It allows investors to better assess their organization's potential risk-adjusted returns, ability to meet financial obligations, general exposure to climate-related issues, and progress in managing or adapting to those issues. Metrics and targets also provide a basis upon which investors and other stakeholders can compare organizations within a sector or industry. So on this slide, we take a closer look at metrics and targets recommended disclosure C, which asks companies to describe the targets that they use to manage climate-related risks and opportunities and performance against targets. Among the key climate-related targets recommended by TCFD are those related to greenhouse gas emissions and energy usage. Module 4 in the CDP questionnaire offers many opportunities for companies to report on these targets. The key questions for this are listed here on the left. The questions are quite detailed and structured so you can report on both absolute and intensity targets that cover emissions, energy use, or any other climate-related targets. The questions allow you to provide all the key data recommended by TCFD, such as, for example, date year from which progress is measured, timeframes over which the target applies, and of course, the current status of the target and how much has been achieved already. David, would you like to explain CDSB principles that should be applied for this disclosure?
Yeah, thank you. In fitting the material CDP disclosures into the mainstream report, companies must again think about how their targets and timelines speak and respond to the risks and opportunities identified and the strategy developed in response. TCFD disclosures should offer investors a coherent narrative of effective response to climate-related issues, emphasising the logic and reasonableness of targets set in response. In terms of coherence, Principle 4 of the CDSB Framework is also an important consideration. Consistency and comparability should be considered within the organisation as well as outside it. For example, are the targets set according to industry standards? Are the same indicators and methods being used consistently by the company? Do the targets or timelines link with nationally or internationally agreed pathways? In addition, as with all the advice offered in the building blocks papers, companies should think of the different requirements and principles of the CDSB framework when looking to satisfy the TCFD. Each company will need to draw on different lessons and learnings when formulating the most effective and efficient disclosures. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. There are 4 further overarching issues that companies should be considerate of when translating their CDP responses into mainstream TCFD-aligned disclosures that we draw attention to in the building blocks guidance. First, as has been noted, the mainstream report is governed by materiality. When repurposing CDP disclosures, companies must apply the lens of relevance and materiality to ensure that the report doesn't become cluttered with immaterial information. Principle 1 of the CDSB framework offers companies some tests to help determine what is material for climate-related disclosures. Second, the boundaries employed for reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities in the mainstream report should follow those of the financials. This might mean that companies will have to rejig their CDP responses, which might be different. In addition, requirement 7 of the CDSB framework notes that where disclosures are made of information from outside this financial boundary, such as Scope 3 emissions, it should be noted and explained. Likewise, when using CDP responses for mainstream TCFD reporting, companies should ensure that the timeframes of reported information match those of the rest of the mainstream report. Finally, for some companies, climate-related risks and opportunities will intersect with the risks and opportunities they face in relation to water security and forests. In those cases, the information in the CDP forest and water questionnaires responses may further assist in effectively reporting against the TCFD in the mainstream report. In the annex of the building blocks paper, we offer an illustrative set of relevant questions to help guide companies. So I'll hand back now to Leslie for a Q&A.
Thank you very much, David and Tatiana. And before we jump into the Q&A, I just want to draw your attention to some useful resources. And I think these will also address some of the questions that we've had come through in the chat. So there was requests for examples of good TCFD reporting from agriculture, food and beverage companies. So in the TCFD Good Practice Handbook, which you can see on the right-hand side, that features examples from companies such as Danone, Unilever, Kellogg's. So definitely head over there. That can be downloaded from the CDSB website to get kind of stickers of good practice reporting. Also, the building blocks guidance, as we already mentioned, is now available for download. And also the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which Marty referred to during some of her remarks. That can be accessed from tcfdhub.org, and CDSB have also launched e-learning courses on the hub. So you can currently look at climate-related financial disclosure, TCFD 101, and also the role of accountants. And this summer we will also be launching 3 more, and one of them specifically looking at the EU non-financial reporting directive. So with that, now we will move on to the Q&A. So going back to Marty and Paul's discussion, I think one of the first questions that came in was around trends that we're seeing between the financial versus the non-financial sector. Marty or Paul, would you like to address that? Perhaps Paul, that could relate to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up, and I'll be brief for now. But I mean, generally, historically, we've seen the financial services sector willing to encourage the real economy to disclose and not do so much themselves. That is improving. One of the key recommendations of the TCFD that financial services investors must also disclose closing loop and capital markets. So last year, nearly 300 financial services companies disclosed through CDP. On a sector comparison basis, financial services has been lagging in disclosure, along also with heavy industry and energy, whereas sectors like retail, electric utilities, manufacturing, technology, food and beverages doing better on average on disclosure. There are good examples in every sector. So there's a real push for more financial services sectors to disclose in line with the TCFD recommendations, and that's why at CDP this year we've launched a financial services sector questionnaire and guidance. I see in the Q&A there's some questions about the PRI. I can't speak for the PRI except to say we work with them a lot, and they've also made some of the TCFD recommendations mandatory in their members disclosing. So this is an area where we expect to see a lot more from financial services.
Thank you, Paul. And just picking up on that point on PRI, there was a question around, other than support from PRI, what measures can be taken to engage asset owners and managers and to get them to embrace TCFD?
I think, well, there's a lot of things out there. Both the Bank of England, the central banks have been doing a lot of work on this. As I said, CDP has the new financial services questionnaire and guidance. I know that the PRI also provide a lot of guidance and support, and on the TCFD hub is some guidance for investors. So there's a lot out there, and I think now financial services firms have the disclosures from their clients who they invest in to be able to really do a good disclosure.
Excellent, thank you. And if we take the question around climate risk being a long-term risk and not necessarily integrated into existing risk management practices, any of our panelists have advice on that, or kind of suggestions on how you can get buy-in and integrate it into existing practices?
Marty, do you want to take that one? I can. You're on mute.
No, I said it. Please take it, Paul. I'll pitch in at the end.
Yeah, I think, well, in all risk management practices, you should think about timelines and horizons. Companies very focused on the financial year, the 1 year ahead. That's clearly not long enough. Most companies we work with would say, they're paying serious attention to 5 years. Through CDP disclosures, we saw $1.1 trillion of risk disclosed last year from large 250 companies. Now, most of those they expect to impact in the next 5 years. But the beauty of TCFD is also the scenario analysis, which is to take longer term risk and bring it into the present. So I think there's a range of things on different timeframes that can bring that longer term risk into present. Being frank, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, not many people thought a pandemic was a big risk to the global economy. It's enormous. If you're in Australia, people all knew forest fires were a risk, but not at the scale we saw at the end of last year and start of this year. So what is seen as often long-term risk can very quickly become risk today. And
just to add to that, Paul, for those of you that are interested in gaining some insight on how to report climate risk, roughly around the first week of July, CDSB on the TCFD Knowledge Hub with the Global Association of Risk Management Professionals, GARP, we're launching a 45-minute training course, freely available training course on climate risk with some guidance on how to report it. So watch this space because that'll be a really useful tool for you.
Thank you very much. And then just a point of clarification for David. During your presentation, you spoke about CDSB's principle on environmental information if material. The environmental impacts or results it describes are due to their size and nature expected to have a significant positive or negative impact. Is it possible to kind of quantify what a significant positive or negative impact, or is there any kind of further guidance you could give on what that could mean?
We don't want to set prescriptive rules of something is significant if it's above X or below Y. This is very much up for companies to decide when they're preparing a mainstream report. It's about their materiality definitions. We don't offer them a definite definition of materiality. That's for them to decide between the nature of their business, their outlook, and also the nature of their investors, what they're after. So it's very much a company by company basis of what will be significant, positive or negative impact.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then another question here around science-based targets versus self-selecting benchmarks. Are we seeing a trend more towards science-based targets now?
Yeah, I can pick that one up, if that's okay. I mean, absolutely. From the disclosures we have last year through CDP, 79% of the companies set some form of target, but only 48% of those are absolute emissions reduction targets. And we know that, you know, as I said at the start, the economy needs to reduce emissions by 50% in the next decade. So we have to have absolute emissions reductions. Last year, 11% of companies who disclosed have got a science-based target. There's about 860 companies now committed to setting a science-based target, and that will be a big push of COP26. So ultimately, what COP26 and many governments are saying is every company should have a long-term net zero target by 2050 or earlier, and set a science-based target to show a robust pathway transition over the next 5 years. So I think this is becoming a new norm in the way climate disclosure has become a new norm.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. That does bring the session almost to a close. So I want to thank all of our panelists, to Marty, to Paul, to Tatiana and David for joining us today. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I think probably to close, you know, if we haven't managed to address your question directly, please do drop us a line and we can answer it directly, or we can point in the direction of someone who can help. So I think maybe just to finish up, if we could do a very quick fire round. We've got 1 minute left between all our panelists. And one question that came in that I thought would nicely summarise and finish off the discussion with how the push for a green, more resilient recovery and kind of a climate resilient future, how do you think that's going to help all of your work kind of moving into 2020 or 2021 and beyond?
I mean, I'll just say very briefly, I touched on it earlier, it's absolutely fundamentally important that as governments help the recovery and renewal from the COVID pandemic, that they bring in, like Canada has done with that TCFD requirement, to build the low carbon transition, accelerate the low carbon transition. We cannot lock in the economy of the past. We have to use this crisis, which is very challenging as we recover from it, to build the green, sustainable, low carbon economy of the future.
And just to say, I think that will help really create some momentum coming out of 2020 into 2021. This was going to be the year of climate change and the super year for nature, and we can't lose sight of the targets and the aspirations that we were setting for those. So I think the green and resilient recovery, is absolutely essential if we're going to meet any of our targets before 2030 and 2050.
Great. Tatiana, would you like to add anything to the discussion?
No, not really. I just fully agree with Paul and Marty, and I don't think I can summarize it in a better way than they did. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we're all in agreement then. Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all our attendees who joined us today. We had such a great diverse group of participants, and the interactivity has been fantastic. So as I said, if we haven't managed to address your question directly, do get in touch, and we will also follow up with a copy of the recording, the slides and the guidance. So thank you very much to everyone who joined us. Once again, thanks to our speakers, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.